This evening we will be looking at an overview of scoping reviews. This is me, this is my name, and this is a part of who I am. So what are the learning objectives for our talk? The first is to understand what scoping reviews are and know how they can be applied and when we can use them. The second is to differentiate and draw some comparisons between scoping reviews and systematic reviews. It's almost impossible or difficult to talk about scoping reviews without mentioning systematic reviews. The third objective is to describe, which we will attempt to do in a little bit of detail, to describe the steps that are involved in scoping reviews. I will go with this outline. We will introduce, talk about the differences, the steps to conducting the review. We will bring it home and then we'll conclude. Scoping reviews have been described as a systematic synthesis of available evidence, and the aim is to identify the breadth of evidence on any particular concept or topic or issue or field. So scoping reviews are done in a systematic way, in a methodological way, such that if the methods are published and somebody else wants to test it or wants to carry out the same scoping review, they are likely to get similar results. Sources of evidence in scoping reviews include primary research, secondary research, and then previous reviews, as well as gray matter. Gray matter have been described as printed matter, which are not published, and they may include books, they may include theses, dissertations, abstracts, and unpublished conference proceedings. So all of this can be sources of the evidence that are used in scoping reviews. What scoping reviews do is to identify and then to clarify key concepts that are related to topics or other concepts from literature. So it depends on what the reviewers or the authors set out to identify. As a result of all this, scoping reviews are descriptive in nature to a large extent, and so they usually make use of basic descriptive analysis. So they make use of measures of central tendencies, they make use of measures of dispersion, to mention some of those basic analyses. Scoping reviews address broad questions, so they are broader in what they address than systematic reviews, and they identify gaps in literature, and often they may serve as precursors to systematic reviews. So many systematic reviews that are carried out have already, they are carried out after a scoping review to a related matter has been done. So when we talk about scoping reviews and when we come across articles, scoping review articles, we usually hear them use the term map even in their title. Mapping then refers to that process of summarizing the extent of evidence. Okay, so mapping is when the extent of the evidence is summarized. That is what mapping refers to. We must remember that scoping reviews are not suited to answer questions that are narrow and specific. Questions that relate to the feasibility or the appropriateness of a method or an intervention or a phenomenon. They are not suited to answer questions that relate to the meaningfulness of such or the effectiveness of such. So when we read, or if we want to carry out studies that have to do with effectiveness, appropriateness, then scoping reviews is not what we want to do. Rather, we want to employ systematic reviews. Now, to carry out a successful scoping review, one has to collaborate. So team approach is recommended in carrying out scoping reviews by best practices. In fact, some people will tell you that if they come across a scoping review that has only one author, they will not read it because that review is subject to a lot of bias because it's just one reviewer. So, the first methodological framework for conducting scoping reviews was published by Axie and O'Malley, and since then there have been revisions on that framework. One of the popular revisions is that employed by Joanna Briggs Institute Scoping Review Methodology Group, and that is what we will use as a guide in discussing the steps to conducting scoping reviews. Right. Scoping reviews versus systematic reviews. Let's look at their similarities as well as their differences. So, in both cases, an a priori review protocol is needed. In fact, it is essential, which means that just as we submit protocols to the ethics institutions, ethics bodies and committees before we carry out primary research, we also need to have a prior protocol before conducting either a scoping review or a systematic review. And this is important so that, as much as possible, we eliminate bias. This is particularly so because it's a repetitive process, conducting scope, the steps involved. And so there's likely to be, that tendency to vary. So a protocol before the experience is what is referred to as an a priori review protocol. Prospero registration of that review protocol is mandatory in systematic reviews, but not so in scoping reviews. So Prospero is a registry of systematic reviews, and so it is compulsory if one wants to carry out a systematic review to register that protocol in Prospero so that anybody in the future who wants to conduct a similar study or maybe the same study can go check in the registry and see if that study has been carried out. And so it will inform them whether to carry out a similar study, if what they want to do exactly has already been carried out, especially if it was a long time ago, then there's no need to repeat the process. So that is what that registry is useful for. Having said that, now people and editors of journals are becoming more stringent before they accept either a systematic review or a scoping review. So it is recommended that even for scoping reviews, one should have published a protocol, registered a protocol beforehand. And but Prospero will not be the way to go because Prospero is really for systematic reviews. But there are other journals that accept publishing these protocols. The Open Science Framework is another registry that one can use in publishing protocols of scoping reviews. Now, for both scoping reviews and systematic reviews, the process is explicit, transparent, and peer-reviewed. And so is the set strategy. They both employ set strategies which are, follow these characteristics. They both also use standardized data extraction forms, which means that they have relevant data to be extracted from each of those articles that will be part of the scoping review. So they need to have standardized data extraction forms. There is something called critical appraisal of articles, otherwise known as risk of bias assessment. And this judges, the skill of bias of each article as it is relevant to the study. So this critical appraisal, this risk of bias assessment uses scores, and there are many tools that can be used. But generally, the aim at the end of the day is to say, oh, this article has a low risk of bias, perhaps a moderate risk of bias, or a high risk of bias. So whoever is reading the review, the systematic review, knows where to place that article when that article is referred to. This critical appraisal is not mandatory in scoping reviews. Now, summary of findings is an essential part of what is required in a systematic review, which is a synthesis of findings from individual studies. So this is compulsory in systematic reviews, but not so much in scoping review. So those are generally the similarities and the differences between scoping reviews and systematic reviews. Now let's get to how to conduct a scoping review. So, because scoping reviews need collaborative work, team effort, then it requires at least 2 reviewers, but not limited to 2 reviewers. We have already talked about this a priori review protocol, which must have well-defined objectives and methods. And of course, it must have a preset inclusion criteria as well as exclusion criteria, and that is what determines what articles are used for the scoping review and what articles are excluded from the scoping review. As much as possible, the protocol should be strictly adhered to. If the protocol has been published and there is a deviation in the methods from what has been published, then in writing the manuscript, one will have to clearly explain and justify the reasons for those deviations. Some editors would go to check the published protocols and they may not accept to publish that paper if there are discrepancies, except either the protocol, if the reviewers go back to change the protocol or give explicit reasons of why the protocol was not strictly adhered to. This is what the Axie-Anomaly methodological framework looks like. The first step is to identify the research question, and a few weeks ago we talked about that research questions and we used mnemonics like find a map, so that also applies here. The next step is to search for relevant studies, and out of the pool of relevant studies to now select the studies that will answer the research question. Next is to chart the data, then to collate, to summarize, and then to report the results. And the final step is to consult with stakeholders to inform validity of study findings. But for this last step, it's not compulsory, and many people that worked, on reforming, reframing this framework, jettison that last step altogether. The one we're going to be talking about by Joanna Briggs Institute there is no place for consulting with stakeholders. So I have borrowed this figure from one of the references, and it says step by step what we need to do in the scoping review. I think this is very useful to you. So we will go over each of these steps, but let me just run over what we have here. So the first one, as we talked about, is to look for a research question and to hone down on that research question, narrow down on the research question. Then our protocol comes into place, a protocol that will include criteria, the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. Then we will now form the relevant search terms which we will use in search engines, so that those search engines can help us to bring up the articles that we seek. Yes, we will identify the relevant search databases, and once we have our articles, we will conduct the systematic search in 2 steps. We'll talk about these 2 steps later. Once we have all the articles we need, we will extract the data from each of them. We will synthesize the data from all of them. We will report our findings. We will interpret. We will discuss, even as we draft a manuscript. Yes, so let's go to the title of the scoping review. We talked about that research question. Titles are usually formed from the research question. So anybody who is looking at the title of a good title knows what the research questions are. Other than final marks, there are also key elements that the title must embrace. There are different frameworks for this, but I've chosen here to use the PCC, which refers to the population, the concepts, and the context. Population, which population is this study, being carried out? And then the concept refers to the what, the meat of the matter, what the key concept that, the key factor that one is setting out to investigate. Then in what context? Is it in a Nigerian context? Is it in Nigeria? Is it in sub-Saharan Africa? Is it globally? Or is it in the community or in a hospital? So those are that's what is meant by context. So now we have explained the population, the concept, and the context. So as an illustration, let's look at this study. It says clinical course and outcomes in adults with co-occurring hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and hypertension. So what they're seeking to look out for, the key concept there, is the clinical course and the outcomes. The population that's being used here are adults, not children, but adults. And then the context is that co-occurring hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and hypertension. So that is this example here. There are other frameworks. There's the one that is referred to as a PICO. PICO refers to population, the same as we have here. I is the intervention. C is comparator, when there are groups to be compared. And O is the outcome. What exactly is, being looked for? What's the outcome? So if we're going to do PICO, for example, I give an example of a title. Perhaps is to look at the use of virtual reality in the treatment of malaria in children. So the use of virtual reality in the treatment of malaria in children. P, children, because we are looking at that, that's the population, children. I here stands for intervention. So the intervention here is that virtual reality. Okay. C will refer to the comparison group, which means that some people may have employed virtual reality in the treatment of malaria. Another group may not have. So we now have 2 groups, and then the treatment of malaria, that's the outcome. What's the use of that virtual reality in the treatment of malaria? So maybe the outcomes may read successful or unsuccessful or something like that. So I just went over that to say that there are other frameworks, and whatever framework is applied depends on the type of scoping review and the question, the research question that the scoping review sets out to address. So, how do we search the evidence? A scoping review should search at least 2 databases. Generally, databases include PubMed, Scopus, Embase, Web of Science. Some people use Google Scholar. It's also a database and difficult to ignore in the times we live in. But I just want to draw attention to the fact that some journals may not accept Google Scholar as a database for a number of reasons. One of which is that anything goes into Google Scholar, and even though it's an academic database, perhaps not all the articles that get in there are peer-reviewed, unlike what obtains with PubMed, Scopus, Embase, Web of Science, and the others. So that is not to say that Google Scholar cannot be used, but if you want to conduct a scoping review, it will be advisable to do one of these other databases. And of course, you can include Google Scholar. But if you have only Google Scholar and Scopus and you submit it to a journal, then there is a risk, that the journal may say, oh, Google Scholar is the second database, and we don't look at Google Scholar. But if you have 2 others, then Google Scholar is supportive, comes as a third. I just thought to bring that up. Then these articles that have been gathered from the different databases are then pulled together. So if one is using PubMed, Scopus, and Google Scholar, as 3 databases, one may be able to get, for example, 1,000 articles from PubMed, maybe 2,000 from Scopus, maybe 500 from Google Scholar. So all of these are pulled. They may be pulled into Microsoft Excel or into newer applications that have been very useful in conducting scoping reviews or systematic reviews. And these applications include Covidence or Ryan. So they help too. You can pull in there and you can go through the screening processes that we will talk about in there. Microsoft Excel, fantastic, but it's a more laborious process than using Covidence or Ryan. So if you're going to conduct a scoping review, I advise either the use of Covidence or Ryan. So the search strategy refers to the search terms that are employed in looking for related articles for each of the databases. This example I have also borrowed from an article that was written on the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in South Africa. So if you look at number 1, you see that they pulled search terms, anything that relates to diabetes together. So they have their instruction is to the search engine is search diabetes or diabetes mellitus or type 2 diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, any synonym that type 2 diabetes is related with, they put in here as a search term for diabetes. Next, they looked at where are we doing this? What's the South Africa. So what other names does South Africa go by? Oh, Southern Africa. So they put that there. So that's generally the concept. So all of this together constitutes the search strategy. I don't want to talk too much about the search strategy because our next lecture, which comes up in 2 weeks' time, is going to be taken by somebody who has a lot of experience, a librarian who has a lot of experience with search strategies. And so she's going to teach us how to use search strategies and how we can coin the strategies that we will use in getting the relevant articles that we need. So now that we have a search strategy, we will go through the databases and instruct them. So let me just mention that briefly that each database understands instructions differently. But what is important is to have that set strategy, and then it can be modified for each of the search engines. Now, let's go further into the steps that are involved. So the next step in selecting the studies is title and abstract screening. So we screen at two levels. The first being the title and abstract screening, which means exactly what it says. So we will look at the title, we'll read the abstract, and we'll see if it goes with the research question. Does it meet the preset inclusion and exclusion criteria? If it does, we'll put it in. If it doesn't, we exclude it. Okay, and this stage requires at least two reviewers, at least two. There may be more reviewers involved, and that means there's also the risk of making different decisions. So while one reviewer may decide that an article suits the study, another may say, oh no, I'm going to exclude it because it doesn't suit the study. But each of them work independently. And once they have finished their independent work, they look at everything and see those differences. The similarities fine, but those differences in decisions are what I refer to as conflicts. So those conflicts need to be resolved. They may be resolved either by consensus when the reviewers discuss, oh, why did you put this article in? Or why did you exclude that? And they discuss and they come to an agreement whether the article should be in or out. Another way to resolve this conflict is to get a third reviewer who understands the work at hand, who is an expert, so to say, in this field, and that third reviewer may be able to help to resolve conflict. So conflict can be resolved in any of these two ways. The next step after that is the full text screening. So let's say that the initial selected studies were 500, and after the title and abstract screening, 250 were excluded. That means one is now left with, the reviewers are left with 250. So for those 250, what they need to do next is to retrieve the full articles, not the abstracts, the full articles, and they will read each of those articles to check whether they fit in or whether they should be excluded from the study. The process is similar to what happens in the first stage. Two reviewers, and conflict is resolved in the manner that I have described. Now, the final articles are those that make it to the last stage of the selecting of studies. So maybe from 250, they might eventually decide that, oh, out of these 250, only 30 or 50 or 60 meet our inclusion criteria, and so we will exclude the rest of them. When they get the total number, whatever it may be, it is from that total number that the relevant data they need will be extracted from. Now, we've been talking about extracting the data. To be able to extract the data, we talked about a data extraction form or tool. And this is something like what it looks like. Okay, so it looks like this. So you have the serial number, and then data to be extracted will include things like the first author, the year of publication, or even the journal that that article was published in, the type of study. Meaning, is it a review article, a secondary kind of study, or is it a primary study? The country, was it in Nigeria or was it in Namibia? Okay, and then the other data that will be extracted depends on the research question, and so that's how the data will be extracted. For this stage also, it is advised that To eliminate bias as much as possible, then there should be at least two people who will independently extract the data. But before, part of the protocol, they would have said what kind of data they want to extract. So the information on what they'll be extracting is uniform, only that they will do it independently. And once they have finished extracting it independently, they will come together again and see the similarities, the differences. The purpose of all of this is to get a good job done and, as much as possible, eliminate bias and mistakes. So after extracting the data, what next? Okay, so the steps from there on are similar to what we do when we report our findings on primary studies. So the data that was extracted is now charted, which means that that data is represented in the form of figures or diagrams or tables. So that's what charting the data means. And when this is done, then they now have to report the findings, the meanings of the findings, the interpretation of the findings. And all of this is done while the manuscript is being prepared. Now, for systematic reviews, there's something that is called the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Okay, let me say that in a few weeks, so right after the lecture on search strategy, the next lecture that will come up will be on systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So there's a preferred reporting system, which is known as Prisma, for those systematic and reviews and meta-analysis. However, in I think the last 6 years, there is now one that is specific for scoping reviews. And so there's a checklist of items, that 20 to 22 items that one needs to ensure one has covered before wanting to publish this scoping review. And the link is right there. We can check it out. So as we round up, how do we bring it home? It's not enough that we have heard this. It's also good for us to be able to apply it and, as our way of contributing to knowledge and engaging in scoping reviews. We are conversant with primary research. I think it's time that we step up our game and start to think of doing scoping reviews. And to be able to do scoping reviews the way it should be done, now that we need to collaborate. But it is something that we can definitely explore. Scoping reviews needs a high level of commitment so that we can get great results. And it may take several weeks or months to complete, depending on how available and how committed team members are. Regular meetings are necessary, to update one another on the team, on progress, and to resolve whatever conflicts may arise at any point in time, and to agree on consensus. Some of these areas of conflict and agreements we have already addressed, but regular meetings is mandatory. Again, because not all the team members are doing everything at the same time. So while some team members may be the ones doing the set strategy, we may appoint other team members to do title and abstract screening, another set of team members to do the full text screening, and so on and so forth. But everybody needs to know what everyone is doing, and so we need to meet regularly. It's also good to be able to chart the timelines, so that results can be achieved in a timely fashion. So I like to conclude by saying that scoping reviews, as we now know, are useful to expand knowledge. And we did say that they are broader in scope when compared with systematic reviews. And they are important because for many of them, they set as those precursors, for systematic reviews. And for both scoping reviews and systematic reviews, they are produced to a large extent, a similar way, similar to the extent that the methodology is methodological, and one needs to be, well, if done well, then somebody else can reproduce the same result. And of course, you do know that scoping reviews are possible with great teamwork and commitment. These are my references, and I thank you for your kind attention.